Good morning, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and welcome back to Law and Crime. This is where we cover some of the most interesting live trials in the country today. And speaking of the country, we are going to go all across the country when I recap everything that we're doing today. So you ready? You ready to do this? Let's start. Okay, first thing, as you know, we are in verdict watch in the Claude Tex McIver case out of Atlanta, Georgia. We've been following this case every second, every minute, day by day, and we are still in verdict watch. Now, I should tell you, again, this is the case about that prominent local attorney, Mr. Tex McIver, who is on trial for shooting and killing his wife, Diane McIver, shooting her from the backseat of a moving car. The defense is saying that this was all a tragic accident, while the prosecution, is saying that he did this for a financial motive. Now, where are we? The jury has deliberated for approximately, you ready for this? 15 and a half hours. That's a very long time. Now, we do suspect there may be a verdict today, but maybe not. We're going to have to see what happens at the end of the day. How long can the jury actually deliberate without coming back with a verdict? Now, we saw yesterday the jury went back to the SUV in question, this time with the gun. So they went back with the gun, and several jurors took turns sitting in the back seat holding the gun so they could try to understand what happened here. They started the day out by rewatching Tex's police interview. Remember, that was really critical to see what he was saying and his demeanor. And so, again, deliberations will continue right now. They're going to begin, and we're keeping a very careful eye on the courtroom. As soon as there's an update, we'll make sure to go to it. Now, that was in Atlanta, Georgia. Let's now go down to Florida, because we have also are covering the Brian Hyde case out of Florida. Really disturbing, I should say, quadruple homicide. Again, Mr. Hyde is on trial for viciously stabbing and killing 19-year-old Michael Kelly, his girlfriend, 17-year-old Starlet Pitts, and Starlet's mother, Dorla Pitts, who was 37 years old. Now, again, this horrific attack also resulted in the death of Starlet's unborn child, Ari Kelly. So, again, that's 4 people there, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a really disturbing case. And what we saw yesterday was the defendant, Mr. Hyde, taking the stand. That's right. He took the stand yesterday, not for a very long time. He did take the stand, so we're going to show you some recap of him doing that. He was only on for about 15 minutes, and he said he doesn't remember if he killed the victims. So we're going to talk more about that later today. And again, we are waiting for the live feed. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go back into that courtroom. Now, okay, we're in Florida. Let's all go to the West Coast, because we're going to Las Vegas. As you know, we've been covering the David Copperfield case here on Law and Crime, and also lawandcrime.com. That case is really interesting. Not criminal. It's a civil case where David Copperfield and the MGM Grand are being sued by a man named Gavin Cox, who is an audience member and participant in one of David Copperfield's magic tricks. And during the course of that trick, he got injured. Now, the question is, did he slip or did he trip? Was it his fault? Was it David Copperfield's fault? Was it the MGM Grand's fault? Well, that becomes the question. Now, when this case was on earlier in the week, the last where we left, David Copperfield took the stand. That's right, David Copperfield took the stand for about 45 minutes. That case will begin again on Tuesday. They've been dark for the rest of the week, and you're not going to want to miss anything, because during the course of this case, we're learning how a magic trick is done. Whether you like that or not, it's happening, ladies and gentlemen. It is happening. So, those are 3 cases, but I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet because we have another case for you. Another case that we anticipate will begin Monday. However, there was an update last night, and I'll talk about it in a minute. This is the case out of Ohio. So now we're in Ohio, and it's the case of Shawn Grate. Now, this is an accused serial killer who will be on trial for 2 victims. He faces a 23-count indictment. We believe the trial will last anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. We have a short preview about this case, and then I'll talk to you about the update that we had from last night. Take a look.
The trial of a suspected serial killer, 41-year-old Shawn Grate, is set to begin Monday in Ashland, Ohio. Grate is accused of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a woman who prosecutors are calling Jane Doe in September 2016. Doe was allegedly kidnapped and raped many times by Grate in an abandoned house near downtown Ashland, but was able to escape after calling 911 while he laid asleep.
What's the problem? I've been abducted. Who abducted you? Shawn Grate. Where's she at now? Asleep.
After nearly 20 minutes on the phone with 911, Doe was rescued by police and Grate was arrested.
Come on out. Hurry up. Get out of here.
Following Grate's arrest, investigators searched the abandoned home and made a stunning discovery: the bodies of two women. The women were identified as Elizabeth Griffith and Stacy Stanley. A preliminary autopsy showed both women were strangled, and Grate was charged in connection with the murders. Grate faces 23 counts, including aggravated murder and kidnapping. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. For Law and Crime, I'm Rachel Stockman.
May not be an easy case for the defense here. And speaking of the defense, and as I said, there was a development last night. So per WKYC, a local affiliate, defense attorneys Robert and Rolf Whitney filed a motion last night that asked the court to pay a company from New Mexico at least $14,500 for additional testing, evaluation, consulting, and travel that could help them find possible evidence that could help the defense. So again, they want the court to help pay for this. Now, the prosecutor in this case, Chris Tunnell, is not too happy about this. He said the request was deeply troubling to the state, and it should be addressed, before jurors are sworn in so that a mistrial could be avoided. Now, Tunnell said the motion came much later than it should have, and he's not even sure that it's necessary. The judge wants a hearing on this matter this afternoon, so today, to ask also Dr. John Fabian, a forensic and clinical psychologist, some questions. And Fabian evaluated Mr. Grate last year and has yet to provide a complete report. What all of this says to us right now is that while we hope the trial will start on Monday, it might be delayed. But let's talk a little bit more about it right now. I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, great to see you.
It's great to be here.
So what do you think about this Grate case? Seems just from the outset the defense has a lot of work to do.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting case. This is a case where the individual in question, Mr. Grate, has been speaking to the media. And that's, as a defense attorney, one of the big no-nos. You never want your client to independently reach out to the media.
Didn't he write some letters saying why he had killed people in the past?
He wrote very detailed letters. I believe he wrote 2 letters, included the original indictment to authenticate the letters, to say, yes, these are actually letters from me, sent them to the media, and they were very disturbing.
Why would he do that unless he's crazy?
Yes.
Not to say it lightly, but why would someone do this?
It's very bizarre, and the letters were bizarre and disturbing. They didn't make sense. They had all sorts of strange theories for why he killed these women.
Will that help his defense and say this guy's not all there?
So it seems now that the defense is going to be forced into not guilty by reason of insanity defense here, because I don't see how else they could play these very bizarre behaviors other than to say maybe he's just mentally ill and just trying to get attention. I don't know what other defense there would be. Correct
me if I'm wrong, the police found him at the crime scene, right? So they found this woman who was abducted, and they also, in their discovery, found these 2 bodies.
They did. They found them in his home.
Sounds like a nightmare for the defense. But what I want to play for you right now is that 911 phone call in question, again, of this young woman that was abducted, allegedly by Mr. Grate. So let's listen into that right now.
911, what is the address to your emergency?
4th Street, Laundromat.
What's the problem?
I've been abducted.
Who abducted you?
Shawn Grate.
Where's she at now?
Asleep.
Where's she sleeping at?
In the bedroom. Please hurry.
Does he have a weapon?
He's got a taser.
Are you tied up now?
Yeah, but I kind of freed myself. Are they on the way?
Yeah, we have officers we're sending.
Please send them up.
Hey, if you're worried, you don't have to talk. You can just set the phone down, okay? I just need to hear if the officers find you or not.
Oh, shit. I woke him up.
Hey, just set the phone down. Okay, can you get to the door where you can see out? Huh? Can you get out of the house? It's locked. Are you at the door?
Yeah, I am.
She's at the door.
Come on out. Hurry up. Get out of here. Where is he?
Bedroom sleeping.
Still sleeping?
Yeah.
Okay, they have her.
He's unarmed.
He's unarmed?
Yeah.
All right. Right now. You know it. Go through that.
You can't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. You really, really can't. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So again, I'm here with Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, this guy, Mr. Grate, has had run-ins with the law throughout his whole life, if you look at his rap sheet. But one of the other things is he's admitted to killing people in the past. In fact, the investigators are trying to identify somebody that he said he killed. There was this woman who was selling magazines that he admitted to killing 11 years ago, and they're doing like a sketch of her face and trying to use tests to understand who she is. Have you heard of that happening before, where a killer or somebody says, I admitted to killing somebody, and then investigators kind of have to do a reverse test and try to see who this person is?
It has happened for some of the very prolific serial killers of our time. We see bodies that turn up, and we don't know if that's in fact someone who just died by accident or someone who died at the hand of a serial killer. So here they're really trying to use the isotopes to recreate where she was from. They're trying to narrow it down to the region, but still her identity is a mystery.
It's pretty amazing that they're able to do that. And as technology, advances in technology happen, we might have ability to do that more later on. So again, that is the Shawn Grate case. We'll keep you updated on it. We believe it's going to start next week. We'll let you know if there is a delay because of all the updates from last night. But that is the Shawn Grate case. Now let's focus our attention right now back on McIver. McIver, the Tex McIver case, we've been focusing on that constantly. We are in verdict watch right now. Again, the jury has been deliberating for about 15.5 hours. Yosha, is that the midway point? Is that a very long time? Do you think they'll come back with a verdict today, or are they going to say, you know what, we can't do it. If we don't come to a verdict by the end of the day, we're done?
It's so hard to tell with juries and jurors. There could be multiple holdouts. There could be just one holdout. I think what's really interesting is to look at the questions that they have been asking. I think one of the questions was, can we find not guilty on counts 1 through 4, and then guilty on the 5th count? So that may signal that they are coming towards a conclusion, that they have some consensus on some of the counts, but not all of them.
When you speak to jurors afterwards, do you think that this is, because they have a lot to do here, they have to decide, is this murder? Is this an accident? Is it involuntary manslaughter? Is it an accident? If they find him innocent across the board on the murder or involuntary manslaughter, is it still an influencing witness charge? They have a lot of questions. Do you think that they've resolved at least one issue, or do you think there's still not resolved any of these issues yet?
Again, it's so hard to say. That question would make me think that maybe they've resolved the issue of the top charges of murder, and they're still arguing about whether he influenced Danny Jo Carter or some of the lesser charges. It's so hard. With these cases, you think you know the jurors that are pro-defense, pro-prosecution, and then it turns out that you're completely wrong. So it could be anybody's game at this point.
It's hard to glean anything from what they're asking, what they're doing. They might just want a full picture. Or as you said, they might want to convince other jurors about something. But what we really want to talk about, and what is probably in the minds of these jurors, and the last thing that they really heard, was the closing arguments from both sides. And the styles from both the defense and the prosecution were very different. I want to play for you a short preview, a package, if you will, of the closings, which helps summarize how both sides did. Take a look.
Jurors are deliberating whether Tex McIver is guilty of murder, aggravated assault, weapons possession, and influencing witnesses. McIver says he accidentally shot his CEO wife, Diane McIver, when a friend was driving them home from dinner after a day out at their ranch.
In this case, we know by way of the evidence that this is not an accident. This is not a malfunctioning gun that just went off.
The defense challenged that by reminding jurors of a huge piece of testimony.
Oops. He's demonstrating it for you on the witness stand. He accidentally pulls the trigger.
The state says the trajectory of the wound, just inches from the victim's heart, was deliberate. The defense says the state's theory relies on too many coincidences.
Diane tells the doctors and the nurses it was an accident. Is that part of the plot? Is that something that the state's going to claim, that Tex McIver had this thing so well planned and calculated, he convinced the last words that his wife said was, it was an accident? I mean, we're not talking about reasonable doubts here. We're talking about just astonishing improbabilities.
Friend Danny Jo Carter was driving the McIvers home the night of the shooting. The highway was clogged, so she took the surface roads through a neighborhood Tex McIver considered unsafe. He asked for his gun. His wife handed it to him.
If you're going to murder someone, why do you shoot her in front of her best friend? Why would you do that? Come up with one reason that says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait till Danny Jo Carter is, 8 inches away from me and 8 inches away from her best friend. That's when I'm going to commit the crime. And try to sell that on, to Hollywood or a TV show, and they say that's a ridiculous plot. It makes no sense.
Prosecutors pointed to a financial motive.
In this case, we know that the defendant was under pretty extreme financial stress, that he was living up here and earning down here.
And y'all have seen hundreds of thousands of dollars flow into that estate account and flow out. They still haven't been paid. Why? He never intended to pay them. This ain't no Chef Tex, Southern gentleman. He's a guilty murderer.
The defense disagreed.
These are their witnesses that they want you to credit. Every one of them talked about how much in love they were. Every one of them testified that there was no arguing between them, there was no hostility between them, there was no animosity between them, and yet the jury wants you to, the prosecution wants you to just ignore all that and say, nevertheless, 10 o'clock, Sunday night, September 25th, I'm going to kill her, the woman I love.
The case has been filled with strange insinuations, like that the defendant was having an illicit relationship with a masseuse. On the stand, she denied it. Prosecutors tried to walk back that theory.
Never said they had sex. This is what I am saying. It just don't look right. I don't care how you cut it, Mr. Defendant. It just don't look right. And it is not consistent with the person that you have portrayed yourself to be.
Jurors have a lot to sort out in deciding McIver's fate. This is Rachel Stockman for Law&Crime.
What's great about this case is it really breaks down both ways. You can look at a fact, you can look at a circumstance, and it could go towards the prosecution or the defense. And maybe that's what the jury's wrestling with as they continue their deliberations today. Again, I'm here with Law&Crime trial analyst Yosha Gunasekera. Do you think that's what's happening? When you look at those closings, I always find it interesting to look at closings because I say, oh, they make a really good point. And then I listen to the other side, oh, it's a really good point too. But I was really persuaded by Don Samuel pointing at the 16 items of reasonable doubt in this case, and he said you only need one. Now, the prosecution has really painted a picture of why you shouldn't like Tex McIver, but have they painted a strong enough picture of him being a murderer?
I don't think so. So you're right in saying that you could look at some of the evidence in both ways, but as a defense attorney, I would say that if you can look at it in both ways, that's reasonable doubt. If you're not persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt that he pulled the gun intentionally, then you have to acquit him. So I think if you're feeling 50-50, if any jurors are feeling like that, or even 80-20, it's such a high standard, and I just don't think that the prosecution made their case here. Because
you have a man's life at stake, right? But then again, is it hard to argue as a defense attorney, you hold a man's life at stake when we know he's the one who shot and killed his wife? Now, again, the question is whether it was intentional or not, or whether he was engaged in reckless conduct or not. But the question is it hard to feel sympathy for the defendant when we know he's the cause of another person's death?
Of course, it's hard to feel sympathy, and I think the prosecution has done a great job of painting him as maybe not so nice of a man, but that doesn't necessarily make him a murderer. And if this was just a horrible, tragic accident, that doesn't mean that he should be going to prison for that.
What do you think the strongest arguments for the prosecution are? What do you think resonated with them, maybe in Clint Rucker's closing argument or something throughout the trial? Besides the fact that we know that he shot her, what do you think their strongest arguments are?
I think the financial motive is strong.
You do
here.
think it's strong?
I think overall the prosecution's case is fairly weak. So I'm trying to find what I think is the strongest. I think financial motive overall is one of the stronger arguments. I still don't think this is a strong case.
Why do you think it's strong?
I think that it's strong because it gives a reason why. Now, the defense is trying to paint this as a very lovey-dovey, perfect marriage, and the prosecution is going in and saying that's not exactly true.
Do you think jurors buy that in the sense that, every witness who came on the stand really said, I never really saw them fight. They would tease each other a little bit, but nobody really knows what's going on in a marriage, in the closed bedroom, in the one-on-one conversations. Nobody really knows what's going on. There's an outward appearance. So do you think it's fair to say, or do you think the jurors see through that a little bit and they go, I'm going to discount this testimony. They said, they never fought and they had a perfect marriage. Or are they going to accept that and say, you know what? They loved each other. I don't see anything what the prosecution's saying.
I think Tex had a very interesting relationship with his wife. I think that she was very financially independent, but she would give him loans and she would expect that those loans would be paid off. And so I think what the prosecution did was paint, a marriage that is loving, but a marriage that also follows a contract. And maybe that is not something that jurors are familiar with. And maybe that was a motive for killing. So again, I don't think it's the strongest, but I think it's one part of the whole picture that the prosecution is painting. People
are split on this case, whether or not it's murder or an accident, but I think the bigger split is whether it's an involuntary manslaughter or an accident. So in other words, let's say the jury says, you know what, this was not an intentional killing. He didn't want to kill his wife, he didn't plan to kill his wife, he had no intention to kill her. But I can't wrestle the fact that this was an accident, this is a complete accident, wasn't his fault, or he created a dangerous situation. He acted recklessly. And how does the jury balance between involuntary manslaughter and an accident?
It's a very difficult, and I actually think you hit the nail on the head. I think if they're debating things, they're debating this, and I think they're debating whether he improperly influenced Danny Jo Carter. But it's hard because was he negligent? On its face, it seems negligent to keep a loaded gun in your lap when you're driving. That just seems
That seems right. Even though the defense says it's not a crime to have a loaded gun on your lap in a moving car.
Yes, but because he's someone who, though he said that he doesn't care for guns very much, had quite the collection of guns, shotguns, should know the proper care of how to use a gun.
Would he have an easier case if he didn't make inconsistent statements and make very questionable comments to people?
Oh, definitely.
I mean, the fact that he said that to Danny Jo Carter, don't get involved because I don't want you to get involved. Could you see a situation where they find him guilty just on that alone?
Yes, because it's very bizarre behavior. In my opinion, I still don't think it proves murder, but it's weird. It's a case where something is fishy. And I think that's why the jurors have been deliberating for this many hours, because something isn't necessarily sitting right with them, and maybe they don't want to do a full acquittal because they think even though he might not have intentionally killed her, maybe he wasn't even negligent, he did act very inappropriately in the hours and days after this occurred.
Well, we are on verdict watch. We are waiting for the court. I'm looking at a feed right now. Nothing's happening. As soon as there is an update with the jury, we will let you know. Maybe, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a verdict today in the Tex McIver case. It's been such a long time, so many weeks. Been following this for such a long time since this happened back in the day. So maybe we'll have a conclusion today. But that's not the only case we're covering. As I talked about, we are also covering the Brian Hyde case. This man who is on trial for killing 3 people as well as an unborn child. One of the women that he killed, one of the women he is accused of killing was pregnant. It's a really sad case. And what's interesting is Mr. Hyde took the stand in his defense yesterday. Now, we are waiting for the live feed to begin today again, and we'll see what happens. But he was on the stand for about 15 minutes, and one of the things he said was, I don't remember if I committed these killings. I want to play that. I want to play some of his testimony from yesterday. Okay, so Brian Hyde, the defendant, took the stand yesterday. Was that a good idea? Let's talk about that with Yosha Gunasekera. So this guy is facing quadruple homicide charges. He's brought on the stand. He talks about his tough upbringing. He talks about the victims helping him. And then he says, I don't remember if I killed them. What is the jury supposed to think?
It's almost as if I'm at a loss for words, which rarely happens. It definitely should not have testified. Now, I'm sure that his defense attorneys told him that it was probably a bad idea to testify. I would hope so. Ultimately, it's his right to testify if he should choose. But I think when you go on the stand and you can't affirmatively deny the killings, I think it raises a lot of questions. Now, the state is presenting a lot of DNA, or not DNA evidence, but a lot of crime scene evidence that is going to link him to the scene. So then when he says that he's not sure if he did it, I think that that's only going to hurt his case. Perhaps this is a nail in the coffin for a conviction.
A couple of things with Hyde. So we know that the closing arguments will begin today. We're going to cover that. Also, it should be known that the jury instructions will include a lesser manslaughter option. So if they don't think that this was a second-degree murder, they could find him guilty of manslaughter. But Yosha, again, how do you say, I don't remember committing a crime? Unless you're so intoxicated or suffer from a mental disease that prevents you from remembering it, how do you say legitimately on the stand, under oath, I don't remember doing this?
I mean, it's possible that he was under some sort of psychosis. He was in
Is that
terrible.
possible?
I'm sure medically it's possible. I mean, the crime itself is very heinous, so he could have been in a psychotic state. I have seen that, like LSD, certain types of drugs make people act in very strange ways, so it's possible that he was on those type of drugs, although he didn't testify to it, and that would probably be the time, if he was going to testify, that he was on some drug or some stimulant that was altering his brain, because if they could prove that he didn't intentionally try to murder him, that's when manslaughter would come into play. He didn't have the intent to kill. He was under drugs or in a psychotic state.
Do you think the defense did a good job, or at least an adequate job, of trying to say that the prosecution and the investigators didn't thoroughly look at other suspects, that they didn't look at other evidence, that there was more to look at here than Mr. Hyde, and they were so narrow focused on getting him that, for example, the medical examiner wasn't even sure if multiple weapons were used. I know that there were some hairs found at the crime scene that weren't tested. Is that a big enough issue to sway a vote here?
I think it can be a very big issue, but what I would have liked to see is more done on behalf of the defense. Why weren't they hiring their multiple expert witnesses to examine the hair themselves? When you think that the state hasn't made their case, then it's incumbent upon the defense to then hire their own experts to determine who the other person could be, because sometimes when you can't name it or can't concretely allude, it just it doesn't look realistic.
All right, well, again, we are carefully monitoring the Hyde case, but we're also carefully monitoring the Tex McIver case out of Atlanta, Georgia. Now, that case, I should let you know, we do have a feed in the courtroom, but nothing's happening. Nothing's happening yet. We know that McIver is there right now talking with his assistant and close friends. Maybe there'll be a verdict today, maybe there won't. We'll have to see what happens. But what I want to do as we wait for an update in both cases, I want to begin playing for you the prosecution's closing arguments in the Claude Tex McIver case, and they were very, very animated. Take a look. That's the prosecution's opening statements there in the Claude Tex McIver case. Again, I said earlier it was the closing arguments. But we're showing this because we want to analyze, has the prosecution met their burden? I want to talk again with Yosha Gunasekera about this. It's hard to understand how they can definitively say the gun was held straight out, aimed at her back, when the defense presented such a credible witness in Ross Gardner who said it's impossible. It's impossible for it to be outstretched. It had to have been on the lap in a sideways position. It was not pointed upright. Physically, it was impossible for it to be outstretched. It had to have been at least 6 inches away from the back seat. It couldn't have been placed like this. it's hard to understand who to believe in the battle of the experts, but what is the jury supposed to do?
It's very hard for a jury here. The defense's expert was very, very credible here, but the prosecution's job is to say you have to discredit that. Our expert is very qualified, and this is a story, a narrative that we're portraying. And that's why this case is so unique and so difficult, and why the jurors are deliberating for so long, because you could see it. You could take either of their witnesses and say that both are equally credible. And when you have a situation like that, I think you have to find Tex not guilty.
Bruce Harvey took the prosecutor's image. So when we just saw her like this, took a screenshot of that, presented it to the jury in his closing arguments and said, do you remember when she pointed the gun like that? That's false. That's inaccurate. We know that's impossible. And I love how the defense did this in the sense they take things from the trial and use it again in their closings. I mean, could you have gotten a better point when the expert comes on the stand and misfires the weapon? Oops, accidental discharge.
It's amazing, and they were so quick on their feet. As soon as that happened, they were able to capitalize on it. They're very intelligent. They've done a very thorough job, and I think overall, no matter what happens, Tex has to be very happy with his attorneys.
I think he does. But then again, the prosecution does make some good arguments here in the sense that we try to understand what was leading up to this eventual shooting. And while people could say that, or witnesses have said that there was nothing unusual, there were some questions here. For example, why did Tex want Danny Joe to be driven back at a certain time, and which was different from the normal routine? It seemed there were some things in the night in question that were different. Like Danny Joe Carter never drove them before. So don't you find this a little strange?
It's a little odd. Again, his behavior afterwards did not help himself. And I think there was a point where he even said to someone who testified that Tex's attorneys were telling him, you're not helping yourself, you're making your case worse. And he really did. If he had just kept his mouth shut, especially at the hospital, when those nurses were overhearing things that he might or might not have said, if he wasn't really speaking at that time, we wouldn't see that sort of testimony come out from the doctors and the nurses.
Do you think that there's credence to the fact or the argument that, look, there's no right way to grieve? Tex McIver doesn't have good social skills. You might not like him. You might not even say he's a good husband. But that doesn't make him a murderer. Do you think there's a credence to that? Or if you use common sense, if someone really did this by accident and they killed the love of their life, wouldn't they be uncontrollably sobbing, not even thinking about money, not even thinking about what they're going to be doing with the furs, the jewelry, calling a lawyer? How should I think about this?
I think that there is no right way to grieve. And what's interesting is when I was working on Innocence Project cases, one of the key sticking points for prosecutors was he didn't cry enough. There weren't any actual tears. And then the person was later found to be innocent. So I don't think that that's ever dispositive of whether someone is guilty or not. I think we haven't been in those situations. They're very shocking.
Right, shock, fear. There could be a number of reasons for why somebody responds. But again, studying the demeanor, and you hear Clint Rucker in his closing argument say, that's not the Southern gentleman. That's not the guy that's portrayed as good old Tex. So I like that the way, I thought the attorneys in both of these, in this case on both sides, were excellent to watch. It was fun to watch. But what we want to do is continue play for you the opening statements by the prosecution. Again, gives you a roadmap about how their case went and if they ultimately met their burden. Take a look. All right, everybody. I want to bring in a very special guest via Skype right now, forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan from Jacksonville State University. It's great to have you on the program here with Yosha Gunasekera as well. And I want to talk about one of the biggest issues here in the Claude Tex McIver case as we wait for the verdict. We are on verdict watch. Joseph, the SUV, the jurors were allowed to go back into the SUV with the gun. Now, we'll talk about the legal ramifications of that with Yosha, but from your perspective, what do you think about that?
It was striking to me, Jesse. I found it interesting that we would return to this at this point. My understanding was that the actual SUV had not been entered into evidence, and it was kind of a head scratcher to me. And then the judge allowed this And let's reflect back just for a moment in earlier conversations that I recall specifically with you. We talked about this vehicle is literally a crime scene on wheels. And this is a key component to everything that happened. I mean, you know, we were just listening to the pre-recorded comments by the prosecutor in closing about hitting bumps and all this sort of thing, and that this drama sort of played out in this vehicle. And I think that from an evidentiary standpoint, I was listening to the prosecutors. They were making the argument to allow the jury to go back out. And then Bruce Harvey came on, and he said he was talking about the movement of things around in that vehicle. There's no guarantee that this thing has been secured and that it would be in a pristine condition. And from a forensic standpoint, the pristine nature of evidence is key. You know, we can't freeze a moment in time, but we have to do our due diligence as forensic investigators to retain and maintain the continuity of evidence. And, you know, this goes into things like chain of evidence and accountability for everybody that's in the chain. And I'm blown away from the perspective watching this, thinking, well, what kind of traps could lay ahead? Let's just hypothesize for a moment that Tex McIver would be convicted in this case. I think that this comes back as a seminal moment in this trial, where they're allowing someone to go back and take a look at this thing. And because if we go from the perspective that this thing has not been entered into evidence, that we could be looking at something that is a game changer as far as their opinions go about the trial. How could this come back to haunt them, I think, on appeal?
Oh, I agree with you. I think that's been a major issue here in terms of many things that were allowed in the courtroom that the defenses just keep racking up. Now, Yosha, stand by. Joseph, stand by. We're going to talk more about McIver in a minute, but we have a live feed right now in the Brian Hyde courtroom. I want to play that for you right now. We're looking at the closing arguments, so let's go live in the Brian Hyde case. Okay, so there is a sidebar right there in the defense's closing argument. Again, I want to say, unfortunately, I have to say so long right now to Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, any final thoughts as you're listening to these closing arguments?
It's an interesting closing. The defense here is really trying to attack the lack of evidence, trying to present alternative theories. So I guess we'll just have to see what happens.
We will have to see what happens. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. So again, we are in a sidebar right now. Again, I'm still with Joseph Scott Morgan. So Joseph, I have a question for you as we analyze this case. You know, it must drive you crazy when you see the crime scene investigation, these different analysts being accused of not doing their job thoroughly, and that there more could have been done. And I assume from your perspective, everything has to be looked at, no matter how trivial the matter. So when an attorney makes that statement in open court, that must bug you.
Yeah, it does, Jesse. But you know, it's part and parcel of what you have to deal with, and you have to understand that the interesting thing about it is this, and frame it, and maybe you guys will enjoy this comment. When I'm teaching my undergraduate students at Jacksonville State in crime scene investigation, I always tell them, yeah, take care in what you're doing, analyze every little thing that you come across, and always in the back of your mind, pretend that there's an attorney looking over your shoulder, because everything, even though you're in that kind of quiet moment where you're doing evidence collection, and even in the laboratory element where you're doing analysis, you think that you're in a vacuum, but you're really not. This white hot light is going to be poured upon you, and you have to understand that your good name will come into question. But again, that's part and parcel of the territory that we work in.
Yeah, I know. And not only have an attorney, but also have a guy on TV who might be analyzing it later on for a case. Joseph, stand by. We're going to listen a little bit more to this defense closing arguments, and then we have so much to talk about today. So stand by.